First of all, welcome everyone to the BAYT, the Beth Avram Yosef of Toronto, during Neuberger Holocaust Education Week, where there are a variety of programs going on throughout the city to promote the memory and education about the Holocaust. This is certainly an unconventional topic for Holocaust Education Week, where we tend to associate certainly somber things that make us sad. And for our event, we have a very colorful flyer that has a picture of Captain America beating up Adolf Hitler. And that should really set the stage for what this talk is going to be about tonight, about how even in certain modes of entertainment, even in comic books, we can find relevance and we can find things that can help us make sense of something very tragic and very, very dramatic. First of all, I'd like to thank our Adult Education Committee, headed by Elaine Genesov, for coordinating this entire event. I'd like to thank Miss Ricky Birnbaum. I'm not sure if she's here tonight. Oh, she's in Israel. For assisting Gerald and Alex in many of the materials that were needed to prepare us for the event this evening. And most importantly, I'd like to thank Gerald and Alex Hartman, the Hartman brothers, and their respective families for having such a passion for this subject and for being able to relate the genre of comic books to their Judaism. In my brief introduction, I'm here to reveal that I too am a nerd and grew up with a fascination with comic books and still have a modest collection because I find the entire genre just so fascinating, so nostalgic. To be able to pick up a comic book that has 10 cents or 12 cents on it and to bring you back to a time when you were a child, and it was a much more innocent time when Superman could pick up Lois Lane and fly off with her, and that was all there was to it. And that was just the way the world was. But tonight we're here to talk about how the Holocaust was impacted during World War II by the comic book industry, and how the use of graphic novels and graphic storytelling was used after the Holocaust to depict this. As an introduction, it's important to note that the entire comic book industry, in its original historical form, which started really primarily, even though there are antecedents to this, but mostly the comic book industry gets started in the late 1930s. Different people mark the age of the comic book at different times, but certainly the age of the superhero is marked by Action Comics #1 in 1938. And it is designed, the comic book industry is developed and cultivated primarily by Jews, very much the same way that Hollywood is developed and cultivated by Jews. And why is it? So Art Spiegelman, we are going to hear a little bit about more tonight, who is the author of MAUS, the very famous Pulitzer Prize winning graphic novel about the Holocaust, wrote that it was because it was beneath contempt. Comic books was not a respectable literary genre. It was open to Jews. The comic book industry was essentially part of the rag trade. Given the chance, Jews would have become painters or written novels. But here was a way for kids with an intellectual bent to express themselves. And Jews have managed to be able to take those genres that are discards of society and turn them into the most important and interesting parts of society. As it relates to the superhero genre, which is something that I grew up with and was such a fascination to me, and you'll hear more about that. That's certainly depicted with the Captain America beating up Hitler illustration, is that Jews are also the natural creators of superheroes, because the Jews have always been a persecuted class. And who was the very first superhero that helped the underdog and saved an entire group of people from persecution? That was the golem. The golem is the first superhero, part of Jewish folklore. And Will Eisner, who, very, very famous creator of the comic strip The Spirit in the 1930s and 40s, also a Jew, wrote that the golem was very much the precursor of the superhero, in that in every society there's a need for mythological characters and wish fulfillment. And the wish fulfillment in the Jewish case of the hero would be someone who could protect us. This kind of storytelling seems to dominate in Jewish culture. And that's why the creators of Superman, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, originally, I think Jerry Siegel was originally from Toronto. Oh, Shuster was originally from Toronto, then moved to Cleveland, where he met Siegel. And Bob Kane was originally, the creator of Batman, was originally Bob Cohen. And so many others, Stan Lee, of course, so sein gesund, he should live and make lots more movies. Also, Stanley Lieber grew up in New York and was a very, very Jewish person. Michael Chabon wrote the Pulitzer Prize winning book, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. And he has a phrase in that book, he says, they're all Jewish superheroes. Superman, you don't think he's Jewish? Coming over from the old country, changing his name like that? Clark Kent, only a Jew could pick a name like that for himself. And Trina Robbins, one of the very few women in the comic book industry, wrote, let's face it, Jews, including me, tend to think they're a little superior. But they don't like to say it too much to non-Jews because that's why they get persecuted. So here's all these heroes, and they really are superior. They all have fabulous powers, but they have to keep them hidden. Because if people find out, they'll persecute them. That's the story of the Jewish people. The Clark Kent persona, the Superman underneath the shirt. And I'll just conclude by saying, as it pertains to the Holocaust, you're going to hear a lot of discussion about the reception of the Holocaust in later post-Holocaust eras using the graphic genre of storytelling. I can tell you this much, if your children have not read MAUS, or if your grandchildren, depending upon who's here in the audience, have not read MAUS, and you'd like them to learn about the Holocaust, I strongly recommend that this is one way that you'll be able to captivate them. Graphic novels are really hot today among our kids. It's the one way that we can be sure that we know that we'll be able to get them to read, even if they're not avid readers. And MAUS, although I wouldn't recommend it for younger children, it has a lot of mature content to it. But for high school age children, I think it's a wonderful educational tool. That they learn about the human condition through the suffering that took place during the show. And it's for this reason that I'm so proud to be able to welcome the Hartman brothers. I was introduced to them by their cousin, Josh Salmon, who's a member of our shul, some time ago, because Josh knew that I was into comic books as well. And he said, well, my cousins have a really cool comic book collection. Little did I know how cool it really was. Hartman brothers have really a phenomenal collection dating back to the early ages of comicdom, and you'll be able to see after the presentation some samples of some of the amazing comics they have. Please do not pick up the comics, even though they're in hard plastic casing. We don't want them to get damaged in any way. And is it David who's here to watch the table? But you'll see that part and parcel of the comic book industry that is started by Jews is also a narrative of the Jewish people and a desire to protect the Jewish people from further harm that's taking place during World War II. I hope you'll enjoy the presentation, and again, thank you to the Hartman brothers for their generous time, their sharing of their comic collection, and their expertise. Without further ado, Gerald and Alex Hartman.
Thank you, Rabbi, for that incredible introduction. Whether you know it or not, you took the first 10 minutes of the talk. Alex and I are grateful to you for facilitating this event. I'd also like to thank my wife Cheryl for putting up with me and for putting together the presentation and for working with Elaine Janisoff and her committee on the logistics. Friends, my brother Alex and I hope that you'll enjoy our presentation this evening. We've been involved in collecting World War II era comic books and original artwork for more than 20 years. As children of Holocaust survivors, we found ourselves drawn to the time period, and for us, it's represented a way of connecting to the Holocaust and honoring our parents. We'll be reviewing how and why the medium of comic books was created largely by Jews, how it was used to influence public opinion in support of America's entry into the war, how it became an effective propaganda tool during the war, and finally how 40 years after the war ended, the publication of Art Spiegelman's Pulitzer Prize-winning graphic novel MAUS helped influence our perception of the Holocaust and its impact on children of survivors, also known as second-generation survivors. Now, I'd like you to all sit back and relax, because this is not a talk that involves Torah Misinai. This is just comic books, so just sit back. For those of you who don't know what comic strips are, they're simply illustrated boxes which, when read sequentially, tell a story. We'll be having a question and answer period after the presentation, so please hold your questions until then. One last thing, Alex and I would like to thank our mother for attending tonight. She is 101 years old. She's a Holocaust survivor, and we love her very, very much, even though when we were kids, she threw out all of our comic books. Okay, so we need to start out with some historical background. As the rabbi said, the art form was really created during the Depression. And during the Depression, people were really looking for escapist media. The earliest comic books were really nothing more than repackaged newspaper comic strips. But publishers needed more content, so they encouraged the creation of new stories and new characters. Until the introduction of the first superhero, Superman, comic books really focused on humor, funny animals, crime, and detective stories. All this changed in 1938 when two Jews from Cleveland created the character of Superman. Superman fought for social justice and American values. He was really the protector of the downtrodden. His villains were New Deal criminals. They were slum landlords, corrupt businessmen, corrupt politicians. And despite the fact that he was from another planet, Superman was not a Flash Gordon ripoff. This was not a space odyssey. This was America during the Depression. And as the rabbi has indicated, there are many people who view Superman as simply a 20th century golem, nothing more. And many of you who don't know the golem story, there have been iterations of it since Talmudic times, but most people associate it with the 16th century rabbi of Prague, the Maharal, who created his being out of clay to defend Jews against pogroms. The Superman character in the comic book was instantly popular. There were many imitators, some were just complete rip-offs. The creators devised a variety of superheroes who were often defined by their powers. They would often rely on pseudoscience as their source of power, and some of it was pretty lame. There was this one character, the Wizard, who could run very fast because he received an injection of mongoose blood, which sounds ridiculous, but if you think of The Amazing Spider-Man, here's some kid who's bitten by a radioactive spider, and we're supposed to believe that he develops spider powers. It's ridiculous. So, this is Action 1, what the rabbi was referring to. It is, in many respects, the Holy Grail. comic book collecting. It was the first appearance of Superman and the first appearance of a comic book hero. Pretty amazing. It followed a year later with really a character that was the antithesis of Superman. This character was, as he's referred to, the Dark Knight. Very much a dark vigilante. Took justice into his own hands. With many of these characters, especially in the tail end of the Depression, they didn't care so much as upholding justice or the letter of the law. They were upholding what they believed was right and wrong. In Batman's case, he made up his own rules regarding what was right and what was wrong. But phenomenally important character. Now, as the rabbi has also said, there was significant Jewish involvement in the genre, and really it had to do with the fact that, despite the fact that it was really crude and lowbrow, and really not the kind of work that you'd aspire to be involved with, Jews with latent anti-Semitism in the workforce and in the commercial art world could not really get jobs elsewhere. So unless you were Rube Goldberg, you were going to be subject to a quota on the numbers of Jews who were allowed in any particular firm. So because Jews were shut out of these legitimate industries, they created their new art form, and it was tremendously popular. As the rabbi also said, there's a real similarity to the genesis of this genre and the motion picture industry, which occurred really, the origins of it occurred a generation before, where people couldn't really get jobs in legitimate businesses, so they created their own industry. There's a big difference though. By the time the Second World War comes around, assimilated Hollywood Jews really didn't want to agitate on behalf of their European brethren in need. They just couldn't be bothered. The Jews in the comic book industry, though, were a different story. Many American Jews were outraged by what was going on in Europe and really were determined to try and influence public opinion. Those in the comic book industry decided that they were going to use their forum, this unrestricted, uncensored platform, to really look for vengeance against Nazis and really a way of changing American opinion regarding A, entry into the war, and B, regarding the need to participate in the fight against Nazism. So I guess we should go through a bit of history first. At the outbreak of the war, America was subject to the Neutrality Act of 1935, and the official position of the United States was one of complete isolationism. Keep away. We don't want to be involved. And it just so happens that this isn't a comic book, but it's an editorial poster from 1938. It's actually a Pulitzer Prize-winning poster itself. I actually have the original here, which I brought. It's by Edmund Duffy, who drew for the Baltimore Sun, and this is called War Clouds. And you see what's going on here. You see, Europe is really, there's a tremendous amount of activity, a lot of agitation, a lot going on, and it's clear that things are happening there. Crossing the Atlantic, you see the United States as personified by Uncle Sam, really stapled to the ground by the Neutrality Act, unable to participate. And this was really sort of a counterpoint to the isolationist focus that politicians had. Many people in the United States believed that it was only a matter of time before we'd be involved in a war. What are we doing hiding ourselves here? Okay, now once the war began, the superheroes who had previously battled the New Deal villains were now gradually permitted to battle fifth columnists, saboteurs, enemy invasions, and there was an increase in the patriotically themed heroes who were committed to keeping American way of life safe in the face of fascism. And the new enemies were not slum landlords, they were now Axis spies and Bundists. So you see in this particular comic, the banner comic, Captain Courageous, great name, is coming and breaking up this gathering of foreigners who are about to set torch to an American flag. You'll notice that these saboteurs or enemy agents are wearing a fez-like hat with a particular insignia on it. And the reality is that the insignia is completely fictional. It doesn't represent any country that was in existence. The reason that it was done this way was many comic book publishers were afraid to get Bundists or other German Americans angry at them, so they didn't refer to them specifically. They didn't put a swastika on it. They were, frankly, they were too afraid, but this was a substitute. And in the Spy Smasher comic book coverage, which you'll see, which I don't know if I brought, he's more direct in his appeal. Death to spies in America. I think that's pretty out there. So at the beginning, okay, this one, great cover. You've got a German skeletal Grim Reaper who is destroying New York. Now the fact is, New York was destroyed on every second or third comic book cover. I don't know why, but it was easily recognizable. Here, the swastika is front and center. The V that you'll see is an important symbol or trope. In the Battle of Britain in 1940, the year before, the British had adopted the V as being their symbol for unity and hope. And the American comic book publishers in '41 adopted the same symbol. You see, not only is there a V there, but there's also the Morse code, 3 dots and a dash. So as the war is beginning, comic book publishers and their Jewish artists, and they were almost all Jews, were not afraid to take sides. They were clearly on behalf of Britain and anti-Axis. So what sort of impact did this have on Germans? There's actually an interesting little story about the German German propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, who went berserk in the German parliament, the Reichstag, in 1940 because there was a very early article in Look magazine entitled, "How Would Superman Stop the War?" And he suggested that he just, slap Hitler down. Well, Goebbels went nuts and said that the comic book industry is peopled by Jews, Superman is a Jew, it reflects the mongrelization of America, just went wild. And I think it's actually very telling that the one guy who goes nuts in Germany about the US comic book industry and insists on boycotting comics is the German propaganda minister who really understood the potential of what this could do to galvanize a population. So, in March of 1941, there was a development that really changes the playing field quite significantly. It's actually the creation of a character and a comic book by 2 other Jews, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, also known as Jacob Kurtzberg, who helped really shape American perception of Hitler, Germany, and the war. And Captain America, as is indicated there, was the first hero created specifically for one purpose. He was there to fight Nazis. That's it. Protecting American values, yeah, but he did it by punching out Nazis. What it did is it turned Hitler into a comic book arch-villain. And it became really a fictional character. And Hitler then graced the cover of more than 100 comic books during the war. And Captain America himself was used as a propaganda tool. As Alex will elaborate later on, Captain America was not your Aryan Ubermensch. He was kind of like a Nebuchadnezzar Jew. And he was kind of like someone that we could all really appreciate. The comic was immediately successful, very popular, and it paved the way for other characters, and really it mythologized the war as a fight between good and evil. Now, with the creation of Captain America, the gloves really came off, and we get tremendous anti-Hitler messages from the industry. First, let's look at this cover, and you'll see why it's so significant. And front and center, you see Captain America punching Hitler in the mouth. I mean, what could be better than that? And it's pretty obvious as to who's good and who's evil, because you've got one character in the red, white, and blue of a costume, red, white, and blue shield. And in the back, you see some Germans plotting the destruction of a US munitions works factory. And in the foreground, on the table, you've got a map of the United States with an instruction booklet that says sabotage plans for USA. So, you know, it's pretty obvious there. Of course, no one asked the question, why would the Germans have their sabotage plans written in English? No one apparently asked the question. But it's extremely popular and really changes how people are thinking. So much so that within a few months, people try and outdo Captain America 1 by getting more and more extreme in their depictions of Hitler, until you get finally the one that, to my mind, really does the work, does the job. Real Life Comics 3 is nothing short of magnificent. It shows Hitler astride the world with a skull in one hand, a pistol in the other, and in case you didn't understand what was going on, the caption reads, "Emperor of Hate in Blood." And what this Jewish artist Alex Schomburg does is he details everything that the Germans are doing. They're sinking shipping in the Atlantic. They're creating concentration camps. They're relocating populations. They're destroying cities. They're massacring civilians. So this was produced 6 months before the United States entered the war. America was still neutral, but you've got images such as this one, really trying their best to change how everyone viewed things. Here we've got some more anti-Hitler covers. We've got the character in fantastic comics. The character of Samson is coming out of some sort of skull-like furnace that some woman is being fed into, unfortunately. Triggers bad associations. And in this next one, Daredevil battles Hitler, you've got some rinky-dink hybrid cover with a Superman as some sort of strange focus. So you'd think that as the war is dragging on and America's had a few years to prepare, that they'd be ready to fight, but not quite. Despite the fact that private comic book publishers and the U.S. government are publishing lots of comics proclaiming U.S. military readiness, and one of the best known is this one, USA is ready. The truth is that America is really ill-equipped to fight. Despite the great bravado, the U.S. Army was only the 17th largest one in the world, and weaponry was in such short supply that they were training their troops with wooden rifles. So things were not going well, despite the fact that people didn't know it, and they simply weren't taking the war seriously enough. The truth is, all of that changed on December 7th, 1941. The American Pacific Fleet is attacked at its base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and 5 out of the 8 battleships in the fleet are destroyed. After Pearl Harbor, though, comic books really shifted, as did America, into high gear in attempting to rally the population to support the war effort. And you find a number of comic books that really try and help sort of reflect the attitude of America. This one here, Remember Pearl Harbor, is an extremely patriotic one-shot comic book. The title really says it all, Remember Pearl Harbor. In it you see Uncle Sam, the patriotic personification of the United States, striding across the Pacific. You've got the Air Force bombing Japan, convoys leaving the US territory, tanks and the industrial might of the United States gearing up for war. Then you also have other publishers jumping on the bandwagon. Here in this issue of Captain America, which would have come out probably around February of 1942, the little word bubble that Captain America utters really says it all. You started it, now we'll finish it. And that was really the attitude of the United States. They had no doubt that they were going to win. It was simply a question of how long it was going to take. One thing I would point out about this cover is the extraordinarily racist depiction of the Prime Minister of Japan, Tojo. He actually doesn't have hands, he has claws, and he has fangs in his mouth. The racist depictions of Japanese especially were the norm, and this is a good, very early example of it. Next we have a private publisher publishing how boys and girls can help win the war. This was an effort that on behalf of a U.S.-sponsored organization to really show how all Americans, including kids, could participate. Again, we've got Captain America really representing the United States, indicating to boys and girls how they can build a victory garden, how to change, give first aid, change bandages, and what U.S. soldiers would be able to do with all of the war bonds and stamps that were being assembled. Here we've got an almost de rigueur humiliation of the enemy. You see the Axis leaders being either the target of baseball throws, or in Spy Smasher's case, simply beaten up. So now that we've seen we're into the war years and we've seen what has gone on, I think it's important that we try and get a handle on what propaganda is and what it's all about. And in that regard, I'd like to turn the mic over to Alex.
Thank you very much. I'll try to be brief. Like all of you, I want to hear more of what Gerald has to say. Let's talk a little bit about propaganda, because I thought the more I looked into this topic, the more I was impressed with how beautifully this was done. As far as what propaganda is, basically propaganda is what one does, it's the ability to shape the thoughts and the actions of other individuals to get them to do or think what we want them to do. And it's categorized in various ways. There's good propaganda or white propaganda, usually using the truth. And basically, white propaganda, for example, would be like a national celebration, something like that. There's black propaganda or false propaganda, usually used to humiliate or put down an enemy. And then there's the sort of in-between gray propaganda, which is not completely true, not completely false. Now, when we're thinking about comic books, I think we've heard a lot, both from Rabbi Koropkin and from Gerald, about the influence of comic books. But let's think about it for a second. What was happening at that time, there was no internet, there was no television, there was no social media. Comic books, the number of comic books sold was more than 100 times what we would have now. A run of comic books now would be 40, 50,000 if it was popular. At that time, it could be up to 4 to 5 million for something like Superman. And each comic book was passed around to, on average, 4 to 5 people. So they were incredibly influential and popular. So as far as a vehicle to use, it would be a great way to pass the message. Then, if you have a message, how do you get it across? The key is you need someone who will communicate that message. So let's think about it for a second. If you had a message and you needed a communicator, you needed someone with authority, you needed someone with credibility, and someone sort of, if you could, very likable, socially attractive. So think about it for a second. In the comic book world, think about Superman. He was the most effective communicator we could get. He was the epitome of a legitimate hero. He was trustworthy. He was physically appearing. What we have here is the cover of Superman 14. It shows the patriotic images of Superman with an eagle on his arm in front of an American shield. Now, what could be better than that? But there wasn't just one communicator. It's important to try to get the message across in as many ways as possible. So, remember that in the Second World War, there were huge burdens placed upon women. Men were being sent off to war. It was important to develop very strong female role models. And the renowned psychologist William Marston actually came up with Wonder Woman. He thought this would be a fabulous World War II role model for women. And here what we have is the cover of All-Star 12, and this is the Justice Society of America, sort of the precursor of the Justice League of America. And we see right here, sort of at the apex, is Wonder Woman. And what we see there written above is the Justice Society of America pursues victory for America and democracy. Now, if we're looking at the psychology of why things were done and how things were done using comic books, let's talk about a number of psychological ideas. Number one, the idea of an in-group. People feel the need to belong to an organization. We want to belong to a group which shares traits and goals with us. And we want our heroes to be part of that as well. For example, Captain America. Now, we've heard a lot about Captain America, sort of the Made in America, anti-Nazi hero. Basically, he was part of our in-group. He was one of us. He was born poor. He loved his country. Everything about him told us that everything he cared about was doing whatever he could to protect America. So if Captain America tells you that if you're on my side, you better do what I want you to do and do what I want you to say, that's exactly what the propagandists are the message that they're sending. Sorry. Also, we see that, Also, we see that Superman was part of an in-group as well. Thank you. Sorry. Here we see Superman as part of an in-group, walking arm in arm with American military men. So the corollary of the in-group, of course, is the out-group. And these are people who are diametrically opposed to us. This is the enemy. This is the other. Of course, we in the in-group, we are good. They, of course, must be evil. We are brave. They are cowards. We're kind. They're cruel. The other thing about these out-groups, and this is something that we as Jews know a lot about, they're also subject to stereotyping. There's no such thing as, well, you know, they can be individuals also. No, it's important to group them together, to say they're all alike. And as far as out-groups in comic books, this was blatantly used in World War II comic books. Now, one of mine and Gerald's favorite comic books of all time is this cover, Suspense Comics #3, from 1944, which showed Nazis. They're again, talk about homogeneity, they're identically adorned in, and hooded like the Ku Klux Klan, and these evil out-group people are about to stab this bound and defenseless girl. This is an outrageous example of the demonstration of evil, cowardly and homogeneous aspects of the out-group. Those of you who are teachers will know that important messages must be repeated. So repetitive messages and reinforcement are absolutely vital. There are also a number of theories which have shown that the more times you've used something, the more you'll accept them. So the theory of exposure learning, an example of this would be here. Here is another superhero from Master Comics who's leading a bunch of troops forward. And once again, we keep seeing a number of repetitive symbols. In this case, again, the American flag. The use of this example from our in-group collective memory. So collective memory symbols or studies, such as flags, rituals, folklores, and heroes, were very important. What it did, it helped to reinforce us as being part of an in-group. It also was used by people, by propagandists, to try to influence present actions. And a great example of this would be the cover of All-Star Comics 22. And this was wonderful. This is, again, the Justice Society of America. Hawkman is the lead in this case. So let's look at it. He's holding an American flag. On top of the American flag is the American eagle. All the other members of the group are saluting that symbol. In the background are symbols of American presidents. And in the bottom it says, "A cure for the world." Another important point regarding propaganda, especially in times of war, is how do you deal with cognitive dissonance? And what that means is this. If we're an in-group and we're good, we do good things. But sometimes, think about it, if we're at war, we have to kill, and killing is bad. So how do you try to justify the lack of harmony or the friction that's caused by opposite things? Being good and causing bad things. This is an important aspect of where propaganda has its important role. It's important that propaganda tries to remove as much guilt as possible. And there are a number of ways of doing that. One, demonize the enemy, dehumanize the enemy. Convince our in-group that anything we do to the enemy is deserved. And a great example of this, and I think Gerald has an original up there, is this one, Air Fighters Comics. So especially when dealing with the Japanese and shooting at them, you're not shooting at their soldiers. You're not even shooting at the Japanese individuals. You're looking at a bunch of caricatures of the Japanese as rats. They're not even human beings that you're killing. Now, propaganda loves using fear, the same way governments do. It's a really important part of persuasion and propaganda in comic books. The whole idea of fear appeal is this. As the in-group, we have people against us. There's this evil empire, or these people who they want to do bad things to us. Now, it's absolutely vital that we follow our propagandist's beliefs and recommendations. Otherwise, the terrible things will happen. It's only by listening to our side that we'll be able to ameliorate the situation. Let's see an example of that. In Startling Comics, somehow these Japanese homogeneous, weird-looking soldiers have captured the city reservoir. And for some bizarre reason, they've decided they are going to poison all the unsuspecting populace. So it's vitally important that we support our side to try to prevent that from happening. So in summary, comic books help form and reinforce attitudes really based on symbols. And the goal of propaganda really was to unite people behind the war effort, to assure that we were fighting for a just cause, to really encourage vigilance against enemy spies and rebut the Axis propaganda, and also to portray the enemy as really immoral and brutal. And I have just a few more examples here. Here's little Jimmy or little Johnny here with Uncle Sam supporting the entire effort of shooting against the enemy. These are two fabulous examples of fighting the Nazi propaganda. Sorry. Here on the left we have Superman. And Superman is fighting against the Nazi propaganda. There's Goebbels with Radio Berlin, and he's able to push him aside. And one of the things he's doing, again, bringing this symbol, is the American Liberty Bell. And basically what it's doing is it's ringing truth and justice as opposed to what the Nazis are doing. Captain Marvel, here on the right, has decided he's had just about enough of listening to Hitler, Goebbels, and Göring. So he decides he doesn't want us to have to listen to all of their lies anymore, so he's shooting a truth ray at them. And finally we have our friend the Fighting Yank. Again, we have these weird-looking, homogeneous, bizarro Japanese soldiers who somehow captured a bunch of American children, have bound them up, and all the ways possible to try to get rid of them. They're throwing snakes. And again, it's showing us in a very unsubtle way how important it is that we listen to our propagandists, otherwise bad things are going to happen. So thank you very much for paying attention, and
it ain't over. We haven't won the war yet. So, thank you, Alex. So, we see how effective comic books could be as a propaganda tool, but doesn't that beg the obvious question? If it's so effective, why would the government allow industry to remain in the control of Jews? So I think the question is not whether the government would take control of the comic book industry, but how they would do it. And the fact is they couldn't do it directly. Just as with the Neutrality Act, there was legislation in place that would prevent the United States government from being the direct sponsor of propaganda. In this case, there was a lot of skepticism about propaganda because everyone knew about the notorious propaganda machines of the fascist regimes. And in World War I, there had been some very heavy-handed efforts on the part of the US government. It's Committee on Public Information, the Creel Committee, that had been in charge of US propaganda efforts. The US had adopted what they referred to as a strategy of truth, which stated that they could disseminate information, but they could not influence using propaganda. And they had to come up with a way of becoming involved. The US government wanted to publishers to be officially independent, so that they could then claim that the aggressive imagery that was contained in comic books actually represented what the average American was thinking, and that this was not really sponsored by government. And the way they came about it was by the formation of what was supposedly a private organization called the Writers' War Board. This was seemingly an organization that was peopled by people who really just wanted to help government out and assist them with their communications. In reality, it was affiliated with and funded by the Office of War Information, which coordinated all US war efforts. And what occurred was really simple. Publishers would go to the WWB, submit their stories, and get either a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or get helpful suggestions regarding how it may be improved. Or the WWB would come to the publishers and say, we'd like you to do a story on X. And the private publishers became tacit accomplices of government because, let's face it, publishers depended upon an allocation of scarce resources. In this case, rationed wood pulp and paper. So if they wrote stories that the WWB would approve of, all of a sudden their allocations would increase. So it became an understanding that developed. And I guess you might ask yourself, what would an example be of something the US government would want popularized? And I've got an example here. This is actually the cover of Speed Comics number 26. I actually don't really like the cover as it appeared on the newsstand. It's colored really childishly. I've got the original pencil art here of the cover that I brought in. And it shows things very differently. What you see is, well, I guess on its face it's not that special, because it shows how Berlin would be taken. You've got the Russians coming in from one side of Berlin, the British and American coming in from the other side, and really splitting Berlin in half, which was exactly what occurred. What's so significant about this, and what really wows me every time I look at it, is actually when it was prepared. This was actually drawn in 1942, 2.5 years before Berlin was taken. And this appeared on the newsstands in February of 1943, a year and a half before the invasion of Europe, the invasion of Normandy, D-Day. What you see the comic book publishers, at the behest of the US government doing, is really telling the US population, this is how it's going to come. This is what's going to occur. Really, they're creating the expectation in people. So not only the US military command understood that in order to satisfy all concerned, this is how Berlin would be taken, and this is how Germany would be divided. You're letting 8- and 10-year-old boys in the United States understand that this is what was going to occur. And this is how propaganda could be used. So other examples of messages that the US would want disseminated would be this one. In Batman 30, you've got Batman and Robin giving this GI who's fighting in the Pacific a new rifle with the proclamation that this is the result of investing in the seventh war love. You know, what more direct and influential message can you give people on the home front? Here you've got much the same message, again, all-star comic, this is number 14, where the Justice Society are really feeding occupied Europe. And this, again, the result of the investment in war bonds and stamps. And here you've got just patriotically themed covers, I think I've got one of them here, of the Axis leaders and their flags being trounced upon by the Allies. Again, reinforcing the same patriotic message. So what we have really is the comic book creators really becoming complicit with government in enlisting all Americans really in doing their part. This was referred to as the total war effort. It really encouraged all segments of society to participate. And it really had, it was assisted by the creation of additional characters to represent the additional segments of society. Alex has already referred to how women were involved. But comics were also promoted to collect scrap metal and paper, as well as invest in war bonds and stamps. Female superheroes could not just serve in factories or in other blue-collar pursuits, but could also function in military theaters as well. And that's really what Miss Fury did. Here we've got the first appearance of Wonder Woman in All-Star 8. Her origin story has much to do with classical Greek mythology. And here's Miss Fury. She's actually a spy who's breaking up some little planned escapade of Germans and Nazis together. It's an interesting catsuit, I'll say. So in addition to female characters, you've got the creation of a lot of kids' superhero teams at this time. They were extremely popular, and it's not surprising. Kids were buying a lot of comics, and children could more easily relate to the characters. One of the most popular was the Sentinels of Liberty that first appeared in Captain America comics, but eventually they got their own comic, Young Allies. And here's Young Allies #1. You see Bucky Barnes, Captain America's sidekick, punching the Red Skull and Hitler in the mouth. But this is actually really interesting, this cover. This is the version that actually got to the newsstands, but this wasn't the way it was supposed to be. The original cover, I actually have it indirectly shown here. It's on the back of this Mystic 6, which is itself a great comic book. But on the back of this comic, they've got sort of a preview of that comic, but in it, there's a real difference. You've got Bucky Barnes punching Stalin and Hitler and Mussolini and others. But what happened? Why couldn't this be used? You had to be politically correct. Between the time that this was produced and the newsstand copy hitting the newsstands, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Russia went from becoming a bad guy, Axis fiend, to becoming our trusted ally. And the US government said, hold on a minute, you have to change that one. And they did. Here's another kids superhero team, Boy Commandos. It was actually drawn by the same guys, the same Jewish pair that drew the Young Allies group. Okay, so we've looked at a number of things. We've seen how comic books could be effective propaganda tools, and how the U.S. found a way to really control the industry. I'd like to look at how the different enemies were portrayed. And all of the Axis members were portrayed in caricature. That's just what you do in comic books. But they were treated very differently. The Japanese were, without exception, drawn as monsters. They couldn't catch a break at all. They had unnatural skin tones. They were shown as treacherous animals, really, and ones who didn't fight fair either. There's, again, the Air Fighter 6 that really shows the Japanese as really as rats. Here you've got a Japanese pilot strafing down American fighters, really, beneath contempt. But the Germans were treated in a very different fashion. At the outset of the war, comic books only treated the German leaders, the Hitler, Goerings, and Goebbels, as being bad guys. The run-of-the-mill German was not considered any different from your average American. This didn't sit well with the Writers' War Board. The WWB insisted that all Germans needed to be shown as being bad. And the reason for that is they understood that the US Army would have to invade and occupy Germany. And they couldn't afford to have US soldiers viewing Germans as nice guys. So you go from this depiction in Master Comics 21, where Captain Nazi, great name, is shown really as aristocratic and monocled and really modeled after an Erich von Stroheim, to this, which in Pep Comics, you'll see the German is some diabolically hideous something creature with fangs who's injecting poison into this bound girl. In Marvel Comics number 46, one of my favorite, you've got a green-skinned Hitler on a throne of skulls, tormenting his captives, but even his little minions are skeletal, deformed creatures. So pretty obnoxious. This is probably the most effective anti-German soldier cover that I've ever seen. It's Exciting Comics 39. You see the Black Terror comes and breaks up this group of German soldiers who are injecting poison into candy bars. Imagine that. And then in this side panel, you see a German soldier giving some of those same poison candy bars to little kids. I mean, who does that? So, as Alex said when he was referring to cognitive dissonance, what America needed to do, or have done for it, is really rationalize a lot of the atrocities that were occurring. And toward the end of the war, the Allies were systematically bombing Germany and especially Japan into the Stone Age. And a lot of Americans were having a lot of difficulty with that. How do you rationalize killing millions of civilians? For example, in one night alone, March 9th of 1945, there was a B-29 bombing raid on Tokyo, which killed more than 150,000 people and rendered homeless more than 1 million people. And this was one night, and they were bombing day and night for months. How do you deal with that? How do you make the American people accept that? And the way you do it is through propaganda, as has been said. And as was said, propaganda allows for the removal of guilt by demonizing the enemy and convincing yourself that the enemy really deserves their punishment. The Writers' War Board demanded that, if anything, toward the end of the war, comic book industry needed to step up their attacks on Japan. And the reason for that was a pretty obvious one. The US government understood that they would have to invade Japan. Their understanding and their appreciation of the casualty levels that would be inflicted on US soldiers with the invasion of Honshu, the main Japanese island, was something above 1 million casualties. And that was not something that the home front could tolerate. So their decision was, we are going to bomb them out of existence. And what they decided to engage in order to help make that more acceptable, was really a before-the-fact justification of these extreme measures by showing Axis atrocities. And even if you couldn't show the atrocities, you made up atrocities. So you get the creation of something like this. Marvel Mystery Comics 66. The strange thing is, this hit the newsstands maybe 2 weeks before the dropping of the first atomic bomb. The Japanese had no real ability to even defend themselves at this point. But what we see is New York, of course, is the target. New York is being destroyed by a Japanese death ray. Ironic, given the atomic bombs that are about to be dropped on Japanese cities, but this is what they show. And I'm asked a question about the war by anyone who knows that I'm interested. Is there any representation of the Holocaust in the comic books? And there actually is one. And not surprisingly, it's by Marvel Comics, and they really led the charge against the Japanese. The issue date of Captain America 446, also referred to as the Holocaust cover, is April of 45, but it would have hit the newsstands around the beginning of February of 45. The winter of 45, for those of you who know the history of the war, and especially anyone who may have understood the tremendous victories that the Russian army and the burden that was placed on the Russian army during the war. In December and January of 1945, the Russians overtook much of eastern Poland and retook a number of the concentration camps. And slowly, in January of 1945, word of what had occurred made its way to the press and to the West. And you see, again, it's Alex Schomburg, who created so many of these covers, came up with this one as well. You find a civilian population who, instead of wearing yellow armbands, as the Jews were forced to wear, were wearing red badges of some kind, being fed into a furnace. And this was the only depiction of the Holocaust in the war. So that covers the part of our presentation really relating to how Jewish Americans were instrumental in not only creating the medium of comic books, but also in developing the art form into an effective propaganda tool. Once the war was over, however, the golden age of superheroes effectively ended. Now, in keeping with this year's Holocaust Education Week's focus on specific events in the post-Holocaust or post-war period, I'd like to spend a few minutes discussing Art Spiegelman's graphic novel, MAUS. Specifically, the ingenious ways in which MAUS depicts and conceptualizes the Holocaust, and how it shined a light on the difficulties faced by the children of survivors. We'll only be able to do a brief overview, as there are entire university courses and an entire cottage industry that's really focused on this comic book story that won a special Pulitzer Prize in 1992. Of course, there's a special problem that all Holocaust literature has to deal with, and that is, how can any form of representation, whether it's cinematic, literary, or visual, do justice to the horrors of the Holocaust? And Spiegelman chooses an unconventional art form, the comic book, which many associate with purely trivial matters. It turned out to be the perfect medium to express this extraordinarily personal and autobiographical tale. People around the world could really relate to the emotional complexity in a way that was entirely different than had it been written as a straight narrative. So what's the big deal about MAUS? It's not a first-person account of the Holocaust, not like Elie Wiesel's Night or Primo Levi's Survival in Auschwitz. It's written from a second-generation survivor's perspective and is really two stories that are interwoven. The first is Art Spiegelman's father's account of his wartime experiences, and while the second and more important tale is Art's imaginative reinterpretation of those same experiences. One of the greatest accomplishments of MAUS is the excruciating honesty concerning the friction between father and son, and their inability to understand each other, and the difficulties in capturing the story. It also shows the inseparable nature of the parents' wartime experiences and their effect on their children. MAUS illustrates the intergenerational transmission of the trauma of the Holocaust on the descendants of survivors. Writing MAUS was, for Spiegelman, a self-quest and a way of confronting his own Holocaust demons. The story shows Art dominated by memories that are not his own. He grows up with his parents' memories, and he associates them with them to such a degree that those stories become almost his own memories in their own right. One of the most striking aspects of MAUS is the fact that the characters are not human beings, but different types of animals. Of course, the most important distinction between man and the animal kingdom is our conscience. By using animals as proxies for humanity, we can more easily remove ourselves from the preconceived notions of human nature and may better understand the inhuman atrocities that occurred. The most important animals are cats and mice, represented by Germans and Jews, respectively. In the animal kingdom, they are natural, sworn enemies. So it's natural that the German cats are never shown to experience any remorse or guilt for their systematic killing of the Jewish mice. Of course, the depiction of Jews as mice is itself ironic, as Nazi propagandists called Jews the vermin of society, and Jews were often compared to rodents. A central theme in MAUS is, not surprisingly, that of guilt, both of Art Spiegelman's survivor father and of Art himself. Strangely enough, no real mention is made of the fact that Art's mother, also an Auschwitz survivor, killed herself when Art was 20 years old. Art feels guilty for honestly portraying his quirky, difficult, refers to him as miserly old Jew, and emotionally damaged father in the book. Also, at the beginning of the second volume of MAUS, which was written 5 years after the publishing of the first volume, and which was greeted with huge international acclaim, Art is shown guilt-ridden at his desk atop a pile of MAUS corpses, presumably representing the 6 million Jews upon whom MAUS's success is built. It's profoundly depressing. Even when Spiegelman succeeds, he appears to lose. Finally, Art expresses guilt over his dead older brother, who died as a child during the Holocaust. This last aspect of guilt rings true for many children of survivors, who feel compelled to live up to the memories of or succeed on behalf of the ghosts of relatives who perished. Well, in summary, MAUS is an incredible accomplishment, and much of its success lies in the comic book format that was used and in which the complex interweaving of stories is told. The honest depiction of the relationship between survivors and their children, who simply can't understand each other's perspectives, is simply heartbreaking. This is especially true for those of us who are second-generation survivors and who are desperate to honor our parents' experiences and to connect with them. Alex and I thank you for attending and hope that you enjoyed the presentation. And feel free to ask us questions if you'd like, or look at some of the props that we brought. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll take questions, just a few questions from the floor. Jordan?
Thank you both. Curious, who was in mind of the writers, the artists, the publishers, who was the intended audience for comic books? Was it children, was it soldiers, was it, by extension, how?
Well, it was everyone. The population of the U.S. at that time was 125 million people. A typical Superman comic had a print run of 5 million. Each comic, they estimated that each comic passed through 5 hands. 25 million people saw each comic book every month. That was 20% of the US population. So the answer is, they wanted as many people as, it was meant for everyone.
And the single largest purchaser of comic books was?
The US government. The US government made sure, and the US Army made sure that they, somewhere around 35 to 50,000 copies of Superman were purchased by the US Army to send to soldiers. This, part of the thing, remember, part of the importance of propaganda is it's also a self-fulfilling prophecy. You have to show that you're going to win. The same way that in 1942, they showed that Berlin would be taken and destroyed. It's absolutely vital that you promote the idea that you will win.
Yes.
Once we won, what happened to this industry?
Fascinating. Actually, what occurred was the superhero genre, which was really so perfectly positioned to portray a propaganda message, died. It evaporated. Over the course of the next dozen years, you have a number of sub-genres that come to the forefront. Crime comic books, romance comic books, science fiction comic books. But the superhero era until the early 1960s was over.
But it's like that with everything. Every literary phase has ups and downs. For example, the Marvel era in the early 60s with the advent of Spider-Man and all that, there was a huge renewal. And there's been a new renewal. For example, every major blockbuster every summer is now pretty much based on comic books.
And the Jewish involvement in that industry?
Well, Stan Lee still makes a guest appearance in every movie.
Stan Lee's first work was Captain America Comics #3. So that was 1941.
Well, there's still, I mean, as the rabbi indicated, Michael Chabon and others are still very involved. You've got Neil Gaiman, who is considered a real giant in the industry. He's a British Jew who actually, it was interesting, the number of Brits who came over to America and really made a huge impact. It's really quite.
The only other thing I would add is that during that era, when superheroes sort of evaporated in the 1950s, late 40s and most of the 1950s, there was a recognition that if we don't do something drastic, the comic book industry is going to die. And so there was added shock value added into a lot of these comic books, which created a tremendous antagonism to parents who were letting their children read comic books. So you saw in the Hartman's presentation how the United States the government was involved in the publication of comics during the war. The government got back involved in comic books to regulate what could and could not be put into comic books. And so that's the founding of the Comics Code Authority, starting in around 1954, 55, I think, which put a lot of Jewish artists and publishers out of business, and was the reason why Mad Magazine turned from a comic book to a magazine so that it could avoid regulation. But what's also interesting is that someone like Art Spiegelman was able to evade Comics Code Authority by going into something called underground comics, which also became a cottage industry in the 60s and 70s for people who wanted to be raunchy, depict drug use, counterculture, and they got into this underground comics business, and Spiegelman legitimated it by winning the Pulitzer Prize for MAUS.
Leon?
In the context of the Middle East today, you could argue that our enemies are in fact trying to do the same thing in slightly different formats. But that's exactly what's happening.
Actually,
Can you repeat the question?
yeah, what Leon indicated is that in the context of the Middle East today, you could say that Israel's enemies are doing much the same vilification in cartoon format. The fact is, each one of the countries who were participants in the Second World War had their own version of the same thing. What I brought was a few books depicting the Soviet Union's use of posters as propaganda tools. They were masters at it. The British used both cartoons and posters. The United States, because they had their own homegrown, unique art form, as in the form of comics, they tended to rely on that. But yeah, it's just different manifestations of the same thing. And because it was so successful in the 40s, why wouldn't it be used again? It was used again during the Vietnam War, really by the countercultures.
One very interesting thing about the whole idea of propaganda and using this for forms such as this, the Germans were unbelievably successful at propaganda, the Nazis during the Second World War. The question is, where did they learn that? Because they actually admit that they learned it from the Americans and the British in the First World War. The Americans and the British were unbelievably effective propagandists in the First World War, and the Germans realized we should learn from them. So a lot of the Nazi propaganda machine actually is American-made.
Okay, well, it's getting late, so the Hartman brothers are here for a few more minutes. And we invite you to come up to the table and check out some of the display. Please, again, please don't pick up the actual comic books because we'd like to protect their value. Some of them are quite valuable. But you can take a look at many of the books. There's one great book called what is it called? Up and Oy Vey, about the intersection of Jews and comic books. There are a lot of other books that are like that. But again, I'd like to thank Alex and Gerald Hartman and their families. Really an outstanding presentation, thorough, well documented, well studied, and it just goes to show, moms and dads, Mrs. Hartman, you see from here, even if you think your boys are meshuggah, they can really turn something into something really good. Don't throw away your children's comic books. And again, thank you all for coming.